Good afternoon. I'm Georgina Adam, editor-at-large of the Art newspaper, and thanks to everyone for joining us for our talk today. We're discussing artists working in museums today, and I'm very lucky to have an excellent panel to talk to you. But before that, I just want to remind you that we would like to receive your questions and comments, and you've got a button at the bottom of your screen which says Q&A. You can use this function to ask questions, and towards the end we will have a question and answer session. So get your questions in all through. Also, we do have a live captioning system available if somebody is hard of hearing or if there's a language problem. So you can also touch that. It's on the bottom right-hand side of your screen. So for today's discussion, which is artists working with museums today, is the second in the Art Basel OVR, Miami Beach Conversations program, and it's curated by Ed Winkleman, and many thanks to Ed for curating this. So today I'm delighted to introduce my panel. We have Ahmet Ögüt. He's a Kurdish-born artist. He's now based between Amsterdam and Berlin. His practice is mainly installations in the public space, and we will be talking to Ahmed about a recent show of his, which was held, in fact, in Azerbaijan. Then we have Gaëtane Verna. She's director of the PowerPoint in Toronto, Canada's leading public gallery devoted exclusively to contemporary visual art. And she's been there since 2012. Very deep experience, as she's also president of the board of directors of the Toronto Arts Council. Last but not least, we have András Szántó. He trained as a sociologist, and in fact, his thesis was the institutions of the art world. I can't read my writing, sorry. And he did that with Arthur Danto, but he's now a cultural strategist advising institutions across the art world, from art fairs through to museums. And he's just published, it's very relevant to our talk today, he's just published a book called The Future of the Museum, which I've read, which is excellent. And it consists of 28 dialogues with museum leaders from 14 countries across the world. And most people say they're going to write a book in lockdown. He actually did write a book in lockdown. So before we go to our panelists, I want to just briefly introduce some of the issues that we're looking about that are all very recent. We had, for example, the Whitney cancellation of collective actions, artist interventions in time of change, after artists of color objected to the institution having obtained their work through discounted sales, mainly through charity auctions. Then we had Adam Pendleton and Amy Sherrill, who resigned from the board of trustees. They were artist trustees at the Baltimore Museum in protest against the deaccessioning of works of art, which, as you probably know, have already just been authorized. There's been a little latitude given by the American Association of Museums. That's not all. There were 100 artists signed an open letter objecting to the postponement of the Philip Guston show. And of course, we have the ongoing situation with Nan Golding's activism through the organization PAIN, which is targeting museums and looking at issues of where the money that sponsors them comes from. So I'd like to start with Ahmed. Can you tell us a little bit about your show that you had removed from the Yarat space in Baku? Thank you.
We don't hear you.
Unmute yourself.
All right, thank you, first of all. Yeah, I wanted to give you a calm, quiet time. I muted myself for a second. So I'm glad to be part of this conversation. And yeah, this recent incident happened in Baku when my show was still on for a very long time, because it was supposed to open in March, right, a few days after the first lockdown. And it was postponed, and it was open for a short while and closed again and open for a short while. So there's a show was there for quite a while. But in this time, it started with the pandemic, and it became an extended show. Of course, I knew in what context I'm doing a show, in what kind of institution. But my engagement as an artist, usually my role is to do the internal negotiations, especially to sustain my autonomy and freedom, or what kind of art I can do, in what country, in what occasion. So I was invited with by a very progressive director, and also I believed in the autonomy of this contemporary art center, even in a country where everything completely goes through central decision making of the state. So we are not talking about a country that we by default think art institution is free and independent, but maybe with the agency of the director or other people working for it, and the way they negotiate with their states, how they make this happen. But it's a similar situation in UK also, which I had experiences, or in other countries we think democracy is given, art institutions are independent and free as a given thing, which is not, there are a lot of manipulations, and there are a lot of factors where the money comes from, or the state involvement when it comes to decision making of the programs, and artists are often excluded from this decision making process. But sometimes they're included, so the negotiations happens internally. So usually, I mean, I was very happy in Baku. We had a lot of internal negotiations, and they were not easy ones. And I managed to sustain my freedom and independence without being affected until the very end of the show. But then the war started, and when war started, because COVID, my show was extended, it was still there, and the same director wasn't there anymore. And then there I found myself directly facing and debating and negotiating, talking to the state ideology. And this is not a situation normally happens so often during the show or afterwards, but it can happen right before. We had this similar, very tough, big experience in Sydney Biennial in 2014, when we all withdrew, many artists, 9 of us withdrew from the Biennial just shortly before, when the main sponsor signed an agreement with the government to run the 2 detention camps in Papua New Guinea. So it was a fact that, it was there was a kind of social unrest in the country. And we were just put in a situation that even manipulated with a Q&A that is with misleading information in case press and come approach us. There are moments that artists are not seen in those positions, and maximum they're seen in a position to protest something. But in that case, it was not possible. We can talk about this later. So going back to Azerbaijan, when I was dealing directly with states, I saw there was a post using my name and a banner next to the flag of the country and the facade of the institution. After a few weeks after it was posted, it was really basically promoting the state ideology. And I was not informed by this. So I kindly asked them to remove the post, noting that I am against directly the flag of the country, which they can do. They can promote the state ideology without instrumentalizing my exhibition or my name. It is a fact that it is directly there, present and used. And this was not even internally discussed. I believe if there was directly, we would have this conversation before such posted. So it's not a simple innocent PR gesture. It is an important gesture that is done without having a conversation with the artist, and I cannot ignore it. Because it puts me ideologically in a position that I've given up a principle that I had such hard time to protect for so many years in other contexts where there was state oppressions. There was other kind of oppressions, and I managed to sustain and maintain my autonomy and independence in that, the way I engage. So artists withdrawing from shows, artists closing their shows, like in this case, I request is the immediate closure of my own solo show in that institution, is not something that comes, over a night. It's really comes from a long negotiation, internal negotiation, especially in those countries where independence of the institution is not such given thing. It needs to be negotiated. It needs to be balanced very well. and in terms of, you know, state involvement or private involvement in terms of programming. These are very important issues, and it wasn't a minor issue. It was something would affect me, also will affect me. You know, I turn myself an easy target, but I am an independent artist. I sustain my principles, so I believe that is more important in this case than keeping a show a few weeks more open and completely giving up all my principles, which took me years to build up.
Mm-hmm. Oh, thank you. That's very interesting. I'd like to turn to Gaëtane now, and you're in a sense on the other side. I'd be very interested. There seems to be a sort of power shift in a way. I don't think if you go back in history, artists had that much influence on what happened. And you work for a public museum. Can you give us your point of view on this?
Yes, of course. First of all, thank you for inviting me to take part in this conversation. The thing that I would like to say is that you know, whether it is as the president of the board of the Toronto Arts Council, or I'm also a board member of the Canada Council, in Canada, there's most institutions on their board of trustees, they have artists also, or arts professional also taking part in the governance of an organization. And at my own organization, where I see the benefit of that is that, of course, you know, on boards of trustees, depending on the organization, there's also a fundraising element, you know, sustaining and philanthropic position of the board. But I think it's really important to remember for whom we are working, you know, as a public, as an institution that is funded by different levels of government, which technically the citizens, you know, you have to remember who are you working for, and the artists are both as citizens but also as integral to, you know, the work that we do. An art gallery needs artists in order to produce and present their work, and to be like a bridge between the work of the artists and society. I think it's really important. So I think that in our case, most of our government institutions that provides funding, it's at an arm length type of relationship. And the other thing from in Canada, most of the juries that will allocate grants, or whether it's grants to artists or funding to institution, are peer reviewed juries. So it is other museum professional or other artists that are part of that collective decision making. And lastly, I'd like to say that, of course, within an organization, it becomes more and more important that let's say the governance and nomination committee at the heart of the institution be mindful of who are the people that they're inviting to be trustees on their board, and what are their business affiliation, and do these people represent the core values of the organization? And you do not welcome them on the board simply for their financial ability to support the organization, even though that is also important, but you also have to decide what are the values of the institution. And when you talk about your mandate, your mission, and your values, at every level of the organization, these values must be upheld. And one element that I'd like to that to me has become a shift is where artists tell me, after they've accepted an invitation for an exhibition at the power plant, they tell me that they've actually done their own personal research, looking up the board members of my organization before they accept the invitation. And I think that's a new element that I was not aware of, and that has been more and more told, discussed with me once they've accepted the exhibition.
So what you're saying is, for example, what Nan Golding has been doing and other activists have been doing. So you see that as something that's quite new in a way, that before artists would not necessarily have been looking more closely at the sources of funding, say, or...
Yes, exactly. It's interesting because the Nan Golding case, I think many people didn't think that she would achieve, that she would be able to topple such an important company. And some people thought that her gesture was, you know, a suicide, and that people would not invite her. But to the contrary, you know, her values and the goal and her objectives were honest and truthful, and I think it does show us the you know, the engagement of an artist within their craft, and also their social political engagement in life. And to me, it actually raises the profile of an artist like Nan Goldin, who put a lot at risk because of what she truly believed in. And I think that in our you know, with the arts market and the value and all of the money involved, I think too often collectors, you know, feel that they can collect the object of the artist, but they forget that the object is actually made by a human being who has values and principle, and that cannot necessarily be collected, in a sense that some artists will stand against and will use you know, stand true to their values, and step down and push, you know, the same way a lot of this organization that's been pushing against British petroleum throughout, you know, different institutions in Great Britain. At first, I'm sure people thought they would never achieve their goals, but it's interesting to see when push comes to shove, even large organizations have to step back and understand that, you know, there's a reckoning, and things will change, and artists are activators in that change.
Oh, thank you. That's really interesting. I'd like to turn to András now. András, you were born in Budapest.
I
Can you
was.
talk to us a little bit about the position? I mean, when we were talking earlier, when we were preparing this, you were saying, well, artists, what you might call activist artists, that's something that you're absolutely familiar with from Eastern Europe.
Well, first of all, let me also thank you for having me, and thank you for Art Basel for continuing these conversations. Before I answer your question, I just want to say the first two comments are indicative of this extraordinary breadth of the art world. I mean, we have one scenario which is literally in a war zone, in a almost totalitarian situation, and another scenario in an extraordinarily sophisticated, well thought through cultural policy climate, which you have the privilege of working in Toronto. And that just goes to show what a diverse art world we live in. But I think what does unify these two stories is this idea of the artist as an activist, as a politically engaged person expressing their convictions, and particularly in their relationship to the museum as a kind of foil for that. Yes, I think for me, one of the things this calls up is the sort of role of the artist, and what is the role of the artist in society today. And it's true, I grew up in a socialist country, and in Eastern Europe, Central and Eastern Europe, where in fact there had been a great tradition of artists playing a very visible role in the larger public debates of society. And that goes all the way back to the 19th century. The idea of the politically active, dissident artist is sort of an indelible figure in that part of the world. You know, we have the Václav Havels of this world. We have artists who are really framing the public debate and having a voice, and having a responsibility for having a voice in that sense. Sometimes that voice is activated in its absence or in a resistance. There's a great tradition in Hungary of artists committing heroic suicides in order to sort of completely take them outside of in the most literal way, of the public sphere. There's a whole set of famous artists and poets who have committed suicides sort of in protest. But suffice it to say that in much of Europe and many parts of the world, this idea of the highly politically active artist is something we understand. Joseph Beuys was one of the founders of the Green Party in Germany. You know, Ai Weiwei, we all know, is very active in China. And I think in the highly professionalized art world of the North America in particular, in recent years, artists have tended to stay in their lanes more. And one of the things I greatly lament, actually, is the almost complete absence of the artistic voice in the larger public dialogue. We don't really see artists in the op-ed pages of the New York Times. People aren't looking to artists to sort of frame these big debates. So I think that it's a good thing to see artists stepping into that role. And the question is how they do that. Very often it has been through the tools of activism. And now we have this new element of artists who've been invited on boards and sometimes quitting those boards in protest. So, you know, in my view, it's a wonderful thing that artists are more visible voices. There's a flip side to that, which is the museum side, but I think I'll stop here because I think we should stay on the level of the artists.
I would like to come back to that because we want to talk about artist trustees, and I'd like to come back to that. But I just would like to go back for a moment to Ahmed, who said to me when we were preparing this talk, he said he doesn't see himself as an activist.
Well, I wouldn't, you know, I deliberately don't use that term. I don't think there's a type of artist who is not political, who is not activist, and there's another type of artist who is specifically taking it as a job. I think we could do any kind of art, but the way we work with institutions is political action. You know, so political action, it needs to be taken when the time of crisis, when the time of unexpected happens. You know, we cannot, as institutions as well, we cannot just see that I'm an artist doing one show in an institution and my responsibility starts with the opening, ends with the end of the show. I am a contributor to the common culture heritage. So artist position has been always there. We are building something collectively. And it's not something that I am hired by the institution for 4 years as a director, as a worker there, and my notion and my mission and my role starts there and ends there too. So there is a deadline for a director as well, like an artist also there is a shorter deadline, but that doesn't divide the responsibility. We have collective responsibility to the public, as it was mentioned also earlier in the talk, you know, why the institutions are there for the first place and why are we taking part in this collective making of the institutions. So I see myself as a contributor to this bigger picture, and that eventually is political, that eventually responding any kind of crisis. And this can be, I've been talking about it since few years, before COVID as well. It could be ecological crisis. It could be political crisis up till the war crisis. It's not coincidence that I find myself, or it's not my self-desire, I find myself in situations where even war is happening. You know, I happen to find myself in a sometimes radioactive zone, sometimes tsunami, sometimes earthquake, sometimes war, sometimes uprising. And I mean, it's not that deliberate choice. It's not that I have specific political interest to be, you know, stuck in very complex situations. We are in an art world that is designed in and out of politics all the time. You know, the way it's sponsored, the way it's financed. And I also see that it is a political struggle for any kind of art institutions. I have witnessed these conversations in the US and UK to negotiate with the states. They have to constantly negotiate with the state in order to stay international, in order to invite people who are not from privileged countries to travel there as equal artists to their artists who are from those countries. They can pay them equally. They can invite them on the basis of equal kind of entry to that country. And this has been a conversation pre-breakfast, pre-everything, you know, in my life for 15 years. Now I was finally able to enjoy that as a Dutch citizen. Then COVID came, and then we all became these people which I was experiencing myself, that we can't all travel all of a sudden, which kind of create some sort of, you know, break some sort of hierarchy. Then we are all in this emergency situation, which makes me feel also happier that it's not that my specific interest, that somebody suddenly have interest in pandemic. No, it doesn't make me a pandemic artist to think about pandemic, because we are all facing it.
Can I just say, I think what Ahmet is saying is, well, you know, context is everything. Context really matters, because what constitutes a political statement, whether you call it activism or not, is profoundly different in the democratic society where you have freedom of speech and a certain set of tools at your disposal versus an illiberal society or a closed society. And one of the, anyone who knows Ahmet's work knows it's very funny sometimes, full of irony and humor. And in fact, in many illiberal societies, humor and irony and other forms of coded language have been the tools, because going beyond those represented a risk that perhaps was too much to take. It actually, in some ways, in the illiberal societies, you have a much more refined language of political oppositionality, because artists really have to encode those things in conceptual ways, or through humor, or through other sly references, or sometimes even not making work, but being active in other ways outside of the art sphere. In the open societies that we live in, where we see, as you began the talk, where these very big statements of major artists, in very successful major artists who are invited on the boards of some of the most important institutions, that's a slightly different case again. So what's so interesting to me is how the same issue, making your convictions heard, presents itself very differently in different geographies and different political systems.
I'd like to come back to Gaëtane and actually ask about. I had a look at your board of directors. Do you have actually artists who are on your boards?
Yes, we do. So our board, the maximum number of board members is 23, and we've reserved 4 position for artists. And but we also artists or arts professionals, and in arts professional we speak of university professors or retired museum directors.
Right.
But a few years ago, this was well before my arrival, there was a strict rule that there would be no commercial gallery directors or a representative on the board of the power plant. um, so that and the, but when we say artists, it doesn't have to be only we're going to be bringing in new artists to our board, and some of them are theater directors, actors, or people in the film industry also. So those diversity of voices are very important around the table, because when certain decisions are being made, such as to just I'll give you an example. When one thinks that if you're the institution with its limited resources is going to put an emphasis on, let's say, renewing certain levels of members. So of course, if you spend more energy on renewing 5 members at $5,000, the revenue for the organization is more than if I'm spending the same time renewing 5 artists who I have a potential of paying $30 per. But what I like about our board is that the artists on the board will stand up and say, I represent those group, and their voices are valuable to the institution as much as your, more prominent benefactors. So I think that these this and it also expands the conversation of the board, so that we understand the choices that are being made within the organization, and also that the board of trustees understand that their role is not to or every exhibition that's being presented, but their role is a role of governance to make sure that we're presenting a exhibition, that we're paying artists, that we're doing the work of presenting an exhibition regardless of their own individual interests or appreciation for the work of the chosen artist. And one thing that is very important, especially when we look at surveys that say that some of the artists being shown are the same artists all over the world, having an independence of thought and of choice of the organization, meaning the curatorial team and the artistic director and director. And at the power plant, what we've put together is a programs committee, and each committee of the board has its own terms of reference. And the committee from the programs committee strictly said the role is not the choice of the exhibition. That is the responsibility of the staff, but the role is to look and see if we're doing the work properly? Are we, you know, and I think these questions are essential and are, of course, we are a non-collecting institution. So this type of conversation is different if you're in an institution where you're, you know, a painting committee, each of the members are providing funds in order to acquire works for the institution. One thing that I would like to say about a comment that Hamed made, and that we have seen ourselves having to deal with. So, as an institution, inviting, you know, artists from a global perspective, the number of challenges that we've had to be able to bring artists from Africa, artists from different countries in the world, and you see how, you know, at times people wonder, why are all artists living, you know, either German, American, Canadian, you know, or EU citizen. But when you have artists who don't have those passports, the difficulty of enabling them to come to present their work in our institution, and the rejection from the local, you know, visa providers, and the length to which we need to, and then people say, oh, well, it's too bad if the artist is not there. No, it's a crime if the artist is not able to be present, to speak of their work and to be in the space, so that the audience also hears directly from the artist, and that the artist can be an integral part. And to me, that's another form of I'm not going to say racism, but let's say I forget the word that discrimination, a political, you know, political, governmental discrimination, because depending on the passport that the artist has, it limits our ability to bring them into a global conversation about art. And this is a real problem for all sorts of artists, visual artists, performance artists, and which speaks to the political nature of art and artists, and the difficulties of crossing, you know, the political lines of countries and their borders. So
very, very interesting. I'd like to go back to András, because he, as I mentioned at the beginning, he has done, during lockdown, he talked to 28 museum directors, and I think what emerges very much is that the model of the museum has changed, and the museum today, the museum the future, is going to be far more involved, engaged with social issues. Would you like to comment a bit on that, András?
Sure. I mean, I think that that element has been part of a kind of DNA that has been there along the way. But I think almost anyone who's active in the museum field knows that the field has been feeling its way towards a more socially engaged, more democratic, more community-minded, more socially integrated role. And yes, I did spend my summer talking to 28 museum directors, and I could have talked to another 200, and I think that would have emerged as a key theme. And there is a sense of an accelerating shift, and that transition is about the museum sort of trying to be more things to more people. You know, actually, Ahmet, I was reading some of your texts, and I know you once wrote a text called A Proposal for a Museum, in which you used the words, a museum is not a graveyard. And that, I think, encapsulates this change, in that the museum is not just a storehouse of objects which are kept, you know, under glass vitrines and in frames and in storage rooms very often. It's a living place, and it's a place where the community comes together. It has a larger remit, not at the expense of those old functions, but as an addition to them. And I think today's generation of museum directors is very much looking to find ways to integrate the museum more actively, and as part of that agenda, to make the museum a forum for major public dialogues that are relevant to society. And so the conversation we're having today is part of that, because if you're going to be available for a wider constituency, going beyond art specialists, collectors, art lovers, elite segments of society, then certainly artists should be one of your primary constituencies that you build in. It's why you're seeing now artists being invited onto the boards of these museums, because a museum like that really needs to incorporate that point of view. What I think, though, it means is that what we really are seeing here, what we're all talking about, is that there's a sort of shifting roles for the artists and shifting roles for the institutions. And we're sort of feeling our way through them. And when these flashpoints occur, I think that's the context that wow, now we have artists on the boards, and artists are really going to speak up if they see something they don't like. And people are sort of not used to that.
Actually, when we were talking earlier, we were talking about the issue of artist trustees, and in fact, it was mentioned by Gaëtane that the problem of the financial side is that the artists don't have the same means as somebody who's perhaps from finance and who's sitting on a board. Is that, and you mentioned that you could have a sort of separate artists advisory committee, for example. I don't know if you'd like to develop that a little bit, and whether Gaëtane would like to comment on that as well.
Well, I think that, on my experience, whether you're a large-scale donor or an artist who doesn't have the same means, as a trustee to the museum, your voice should be equal. Of course, and this is what we practice, and I think it's very important, because if you say that you represent the community in which the museum is functioning, that community is not only made of very wealthy philanthropists. So it is for the health of the organization, and in a way, in order to protect it from itself, to have that diversity of voices around the table, and the value that it brings, should be seen at the same level. There should not be more weight to a trustee that gives, once you've accepted the people on the board, there should not be more weight given to the ability to bring money. And on our it is my experience that we've made specific, recommendation that, of course, artists must become members, must make a donation, but not at the same level as the other trustees. And I think also that for the health of the organization, having different types of trustees providing a donation at different levels is as important. And in some institution, what they do is that they also have a foundation board that is associated with the organization, where the donation requirement is at a higher level, and the people recruited there are in recruited with this in mind, as being a fundraising board that also functions to bring funds to the institution. But I think that we having artists and different members of society within those institutions is a good sign of a healthy organization that really says what it does and does what it says. Because it's easy to say we're going to be community oriented, but you have no one who can understand the plight of a worker on your board, because they don't live that in that world.
Can I just jump in and say a couple of things? One is that this issue is, of course, there's more tension here in the US case, where the boards are donor boards, right? So in the European scenario, this is not such a big deal, where the boards are more advisory, and there isn't a sense of, well, this guy is giving $200,000 a year and this person is not. So some of this is a very American dilemma. A related thing that I would want to say, though, is that I think that when artists are invited on boards, there is a little bit of tokenization going on. So sometimes there's a feeling like, okay, so we have the artists who will represent this point of view. Probably the CEOs of companies who are sitting there are not just there to represent the point of view of big companies. They feel that they are representing a host of managerial issues, or that they have something to say about the totality of the institution. So I think if you're going to invite artists, you should on a board, then they should be board members. They should be having a say about, all of the issues in an institution. Which brings me to my third point, which is, at the same time, this also puts an onus on the artists. which is that if you're going to be involved in the governance of an institution, institutional governance is messy. It's full of gray areas. You know, artistic and public statements are often very clear-cut, very ethically driven. But much of the work of an institution is often full of these gray areas, and it's very messy. So I think one of the interesting questions that I have is, while I fully acknowledge everyone's right to stand up from the table and say, I quit, that is, of course, the very last act they have made in that institution.
Yeah.
It's a kind of board suicide, like you are no longer going to be part of that. And the problems probably will still be there. So I think that this issue, so the institutions have to learn how to truly bring in artists, but I also would say that the artists who step up into these roles, they also have to consider that these are really complicated roles that don't often break down very clearly into, I can't take this, like they're not always binary. They're often multidimensional and involve compromises and just very sticky, complicated issues that aren't always susceptible to a very clear one position.
So, well, I think naturally we should go to Ahmet for his position on this. I mean, would you accept a position as an artist trustee on the board of the museum? Obviously, I'm not saying where the museum was, because as András has pointed out, there's a huge difference between Gaëtane's museum and a museum in a country which is not politically free.
Well, I had political complications in even very most democratic looking countries, in institutions that they felt not free at all. And I saw directors felt not free at all. I felt tough decisions that are being made. I witnessed. I do have not only artist friends, but other friends who happen to be in those boards, or who happen to give me, wherever I go to another country, I have very limited knowledge, and I'm always expected to do site-specific work. First person I ask is the local artist, or local curator, or local, mostly independent people who have been affiliated with those institutions, but who have freedom to talk about them. Because most of them who still have ongoing contracts, they don't feel the same freedom to talk about their own very institution in a critical way to improve the institution, not to damage the institution. But we need to have these conversations. I can't just go there as a tourist, right? So I need my local references, and these references are my reference points that I can act accurately, especially in a political way, not in a simplified touristic way. So if you go into any local context that is unfamiliar to you, this process needs to be done. And these board members also needs to think from the other perspective as well. So for me, artists are not by default good. That not all the artists are good. There are artists who have self-interest. There are artists who don't have self-interest. You see examples, and it's easy to distinct them. The ones who have principles for over so many years, and in very tough situations like Nan Goldin, could have been gone to completely different directions, but she was able to self-sacrifice and do a decision that is against her own self-interest technically. And I am often in that situation as well. Like, it would be completely a self-sabotage to take a decision like that. But I do take that decision because for me at that moment, protecting those values are more important in the long run. And that is a quality for a board member as well. So for me, I wouldn't think it's an artist or it's a curator or it's a writer. But I would think if that person showed examples over the years that is based on self-interest or not, or for the common heritage, was able to take decisions, even to take the self-sabotage and self-sacrifice decisions that is not self-interest, and you have those examples easily. So for me, if it's a context that I am suddenly that local reference, I should take that responsibility. I don't have to be officially part of the board member, but if my answer to this outside question is comes with self-interest motivation or not. So I think this responsibility needs to be taken, especially artists who have had a lot of experiences. I mean, I have had experience maybe with 200, maybe more institutions all around the world. This is an important knowledge. And this knowledge needs to be activated for the next generation. So it's kind of my responsibility to talk about small scale institutions, big scale institutions, very large scale institutions in very democratic countries to very totalitarian countries, and how one can maneuver of all these things, and how one can keep internal debates very strong, but very internal, until the moment it needs to go public. So most of the time it doesn't have to go to public, and it shouldn't go to public, because these negotiations needs to be done internally. And it's a better position, of course, if you are part of the decision-making mechanism. Of course, you have a word to say. And most of the time, if you are deliberately, systematically excluded from that, although you are an active member of the local scene, let's say, then you have to take other actions like withdrawing, writing public letters, and things like that. But these are the last steps to take.
It's interesting. I see you nodding, Gaëtane.
Yes, no, I totally agree with his comment, because I find that you cannot objectify artists, you know, and just put them on a board to just say, oh, look at us, we're very open, we have artists. And it will get messy. And I agree with András also that, you know, it's when the going gets tough, the tough get going. So it's not about leaving when there's a difficult situation. It's actually being part of changing the narrative within the organization. And this is where, as an organization, the governance and nomination committee must take seriously the individuals that I will go back to this notion of values of the organization. So you have to, the same way you're going to choose your director, your executive director, you must also choose your board members. And at every level, everybody must be engaged into the organization from an altruistic perspective, where it is, we are at the service of the organization. And that when questions of, you know, censorship or difficult questions that are embedded in the work that the artists that has been invited to show are present, the institution must band together. There must be a place to have open discussions about what is the artist saying, who are they representing, is there one group that's going to be offended, you know? And these are very difficult discussions to have, but those discussions must be, let's say the board must speak as one voice towards one main goal, and there must be a space for open conversation, where artists feel that they can say what they think as being part of the board, but then also understanding, you know, to the public, there's one voice, and sometimes not everybody agrees around everything in the same way, but it is important. I can give you an example where, you know, in Canada, over the last, let's say, 8 to 9 years, every institution, mostly I would say, maybe not the entire country, but I can say in many provinces, when we start an event, we acknowledge the land. So we acknowledge the fact that, you know, this is in sometimes unceded territory land, and land that has been stolen because of the nature of the construction, the history of colonialism in Canada. And within our programs committee, we've had conversation with, you know, one of our trustee who is Indigenous, to decide what is this land acknowledgement that we as the power plant will be making. And in drafting that land acknowledgement, it wasn't only drafted internally, we also worked with another artist who's Anishinaabe, who's an artist of this region of where Toronto sits, to ask her to help us craft that message, so that when I say that message on behalf of the organization, I have vetted it not only internally, but externally in the community, so that I don't think that I can say whatever I want to say about acknowledging the land. So to me, this is the true work, you know, within an organization with artists, and then bringing it back to the board and saying, this is how we, meaning all of us, will acknowledge that we are on unceded territory, or which land we are sitting on. And this becomes part of the DNA of the organization. And that work has been done thanks to outside artists, internal artists, but not just any artists, artists who represent their communities.
But going back to the question of artists' roles,
Okay.
I think that, you know, it's also a question of if an artist is of a disposition that he or she wants to be engaged in these issues, and not every artist needs to be. There are very different ways of being an artist, but if you are, then joining a museum board is one of the ways you can exert influence. But I feel that it really shouldn't stop there. In fact, I think it's not the most obvious ways of having a larger role in society. For example, I lament how comparatively few artists are writing political commentary or essays or journalism, for that matter, compared to a generation earlier. If you go back to the sort of Donald Judds and Ad Reinhardt's or even the Peter Halleys of the 80s, we've seen a kind of siloization where artists are using, you know, maybe I'm overgeneralizing, but I think I'm correct about this, that artists are sort of sticking to art. And again, not necessarily being seen as voices in this other public forums. There are also other boards to join, social service organizations, universities. You know, frankly, politics. We've seen in the United States in the last few years, one doesn't hear about many positive political developments in our country these days, but one of them is all kinds of people from all walks of life stepped up and ran for public office in the last 4 years in the United States. And not as many artists. I find a kind of disconnect there because, you know, there has been a shift to political interest in the art world, but it hasn't really escaped the bubble that much. And so I think it's to be welcomed when artists are trying out these new roles and going beyond their immediate sort of art market, art institution playing field to leave that wider impact in the field. I think we ought to see more of that. I would really like to see that.
I'd love to continue on, but we have questions and I'm conscious that the time is ticking past. So I'm going to put some questions to you, one for all of you. This is from Gail Lord, who is a cultural advisor as well.
Oh.
Thank you for a great discussion. There is a history of artists' unions going back to the 1930s and 1960s. They fought for artists' right and artists' fees, and still important. Would you like to comment on that?
Well, I could say that in Canada, you know, there's a strong, in Canada, we as institutions that receive money from the different levels of government, we have to pay artist fees. And those questions have been debated because of artist community groups that, you know, and through the federal government, and there is a law that is imposed on all of us that we have to pay artist fees. So this is community organization at the highest level, and I think it's very healthy to keep those conversations going. So this is the reality in which we live, and in Canada, you know, there's an organization called a national organization called CARFAC, which every year comes up with different levels of payment depending on the budget of the institution, the activity of the artist, and that keeps us in track. We don't have to pay only CARFAC. You can pay above CARFAC, you can pay below CARFAC, but you need to pay a fee. And that is something that is very much part of the narrative in Canada.
That's a policy change that happened much early on in Canada, and right next to US, where it happened much later with, you know, for instance, same kind of organization wage when it started in US and getting art institutions certified to pay fees. Which was like next door in Canada, that happened way before the same thing, and it's led to a policy change in the state level. And usually this kind of actions, you know, it shouldn't stay in a union level. It unfortunately it has to sometimes start in union level, because institutions should have done it anyway. They don't need state pressure to do so, but it inspires each other. So wage inspired also another moment in Holland. Now it's also regulated. There is a regulation of fees and for what kind of scale institution and so on, but it is not universal. So none of these things, but art world was never universal when it comes to that, because actually art market also knows that very well. So they can actually kidnap an artist's work from Europe to Brazil and no one can chase it after, because there's no international laws to chase after things like that. So there's a lot of lost money in the art world. And you know, there's a debate of fees. There's no international rule for that, or there is no foundation organization can push institutions locally. So we still need to rely on things like trust and being generous, being honest, and things like that. So I started my career with this thing. So I was trusting. Every curator invites me. When I felt like we are kind of friends, I would not read the loan forms or contracts at all. I would just sign them in the beginning. Now I spend a lot of time reading those contracts. Even when I'm invited by someone that I trust, I believe that that someone might not have the agency with the institution as an independent curator. Sometimes internal people in the institution might not have the agency. So I might better read it myself instead of later getting into trouble. But it takes so much time when you remove the trust from the situation. You know, this community comment was very important. If artist is trusted by the community, then you jump over such a big thing, you know, many pages of something written, basically. So we need to bring the trust issue back to the art world, which is definitely this idea of what are we serving for as institution and as artists. So that's why sponsorship lately started to be confused with ownership. And that's a big problem as well. And we should not confuse. It should be always about the public and culture heritage that belongs to commons.
I'm going to move on to the next question. If artists make decisions about who can show or collect that work, aren't they acting like censors just as much as the boards of institutions?
I'd like to correct that misunderstanding. I think that shows maybe that mischaracterizes the way decision-making happens in art institutions. You know, there's a very active discourse about, you know, how these trustees gang up and figure out what the programming of the institution is so that they can make money. I think that too is a caricature. The reality of way art institutions operate is if you're sitting at a trustee level, you're not, you know, hand guiding the curatorial decision making. Those usually are protected by several layers. I can't resist though going back to Gail Lord's question just for 1 second, because it's so nice, first of all, that she's watching. I just want to note that sort of my sociologist hat on. Unfortunately, today's art world is very much set up on a kind of, I hate to use the word, kind of like a neoliberal way. Every artist to himself. This is not a system that is designed for collaboration. You know, every artist basically has his or her position. Maybe they sign up with a gallery. There are thousands of galleries. It's 1,000 points of light. It's not an associated system. It encourages individual points of view. So there are not, you know, even in the Middle Ages, you had guilds. But today, it's a fairly atomized world where there are few mechanisms for artists to come together in a kind of unionized way. We're seeing unionization in institutions, which is a whole other story. We could have a whole other Art Basel conversation. Yeah. But I do notice that, you know, when you see artists' resumes, you know, it's implicit that they have affinities to other artists, but every artist is basically operating as a kind of army of one. And probably there ought to be more mechanisms to come together, but maybe those are platforms yet to be invented.
Mm-hmm. So I'm going to, I think we have time for one more question. What are ways that museums, this is perhaps for Gaëtane, what are ways that museums can ensure that their inclusion of new artists is non-exploitative?
I mean, it's in my mind, I don't quite understand the question, because it would never be exploitative. An artist so when we invite an artist to be on the board of trustees, it's clearly that they cannot have exhibitions at our institution during the time that they are there, that they are sitting on the board. And you know, so there's no exploitation, meaning this is a voluntary I'm having a hard time understanding how.
I
Speak
think the question probably means more inclusion of new artists as shows in the institution as opposed to on the board. But even then, I don't quite see how they could be
tokenism in just, you know, having
Yeah.
artists of color
Yeah.
being shown and as a one-off and not integrating. Is that, if that's the question, I would say that, you know, it is, again, it has to do with how what the institution says that their goal are. And, you know, in Canada and the US, February is Black History Month, and there's a lot of, you know, artists from African diaspora who do not want to do exhibitions in February because at times they feel they're only invited in February to do exhibition in those institutions or to speak about you know, issues of race during within these, let's say, white-led organization only at this period of time. So I think it's important for organization to be aware of this and not to only invite artists from, you know, the African diaspora only in February, but invite them throughout the year. And you could have an artist around that time also, but, you know, artists look at the context in which they're being exhibited, and it is also our responsibility to be honest and to discuss these questions with you know, with the artists, and to respect their voices. If they say, no, I don't want this season, I'd like the other season, and if it's because they don't want to be boxed into the month of February, then you must respect them and also show them that they are not being objectified. If that's the nature of the question, I understand it from that.
Yeah, I think that is. Well, I would love to go on. We have a few more questions, but sadly we're out of time. Firstly, I'd like to thank all of you for joining us. First of all, our wonderful panelists, who I think really I can see some of the questions are not questions, but comments, and all of them are saying thank you so much for such an interesting discussion. Thank you to the audience for looking, for watching and engaging with us. I just want to remind you that there is a panel tomorrow, which is Thinking Globally, Selling Locally. And you can go to artbasel.com to register for this panel tomorrow, which is moderated by my colleague Charlotte Burns, or ex-colleague. It's been a great pleasure to hear so many different views. I encourage you to read András's book because I've just read it and it's excellent. And thank all of you thank you also to Basel for organizing it, for Art Basel, for very good organization. It's not so easy to be remotely like this, but it's been a great pleasure to hear all of you. And until the next time, whether in real life or virtually. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.